really like to know, what are the main reasons behind these mitochondria becoming dysfunctional, not working properly, producing too much oxidative stress?
So yeah, I think the key thing there is that there's never going to be just one pattern that we would see. But one pattern that certainly stands out because of the implications it has, and also because of the frequency that I see that in the individuals that I work with, is this pattern of mitochondrial hypoxia. And I actually touched on that earlier, in that the organic acids test will flag that through the low activity of the aconitase, and thus a low level of aconitic acid upon the test results. And that's where you can often have totally normal access to oxygen, and yet either because of anemia, poor delivery to the cell, or excess hydrogen sulfide production in the gut, which is the case that hydrogen sulfide is a gas that has some beneficial effects, but at high levels can compete with oxygen, meaning that, yeah, the oxygen's there, but can you access it effectively?
So this would be something we see with SIBO, or is this also something that
Yes.
we see
Hydrogen sulfide
with
dominance.
other conditions?
Yeah, so theoretically, it doesn't necessarily need to be the small intestine. Certainly, that's the most common setup where we'd see excessive production of hydrogen sulfide. That's where a microbe called disulfovibrio is most likely to be the suspect. But equally, Enterobacter, Fusobacterium, these have an alternative pathway through which they can end up producing excessive hydrogen sulfide. So this is where, yeah, whenever we see the patterns of bad reaction to cruciferous vegetables or reaction to sulfites, and especially intestinal gas with a distinctive rotten egg odor, 100% we want to consider that hydrogen sulfide production. And yeah, stool tests can be quite useful in identifying, which specific form of this excess hydrogen sulfide we're looking at. But nonetheless, yeah, that's one way through a bacterial metabolite. A gas can compete with oxygen and drive these hypoxia issues that I mentioned. As can the inflammatory impact of mold exposure. That's often something that coincides simply because of the type of inflammatory response to mycotoxins often involves changes in the way capillaries perform, one with major implications for that oxygen delivery, but also the single most common driver of this low oxygen availability is too much production of nitric oxide. And that's obviously something that we've touched on in regards to its positive role when produced in the right amounts, in the right places, which is to say the blood vessels. When we see this endotoxemia that I touched on earlier, this movement of these fragments of dead bacteria into the bloodstream, well, this is where, as much as these aren't live bacteria and they can't cause an infection, all your immune system is responding to is the ton of bacterial DNA that it now finds in circulation. It's not evolved to simply leave that be, and it doesn't. So this is where we get very pronounced inflammatory responses, one that's characterized by a lot of production of nitric oxide, and this is not produced by endothelial nitric oxide synthase in the blood vessels. This is produced by inducible nitric oxide synthase in the immune cells, and we have different effects in these circumstances, the biggest one being that competition between nitric oxide and oxygen. So this is where there's two consequences of the mitochondrial hypoxia. One, we're producing less energy. The cells are having to make do with less energy. Two, we're also having to slow down the uptake of energy from the bloodstream. And so we're going to transfer that energetic load somewhere else, most likely the liver. So it can certainly set the scene for some systemic insulin resistance, which unfortunately means you've got less energy and you've got worsened energy signaling. So what is your hypothalamus to think? Your hypothalamus, this manager of energy metabolism, this manager of many systems within the body, well, it's constantly asking, how much energy do I have? How much energy do I want? If those two are balanced, then we're all good. But if you have less than your system wants, either because of low cellular stores or because of impaired communication, which is the cellular signaling, such as insulin, or because of theft from inflammatory issues, which insulin resistance is notorious for driving. Well, yeah, add to that what we might call stress, which of course is a big nebulous subject, which we probably won't get into. But yeah, that's where we'll see this potent imbalance. What is the hypothalamus going to do here? It's going to activate the stress response, which is specifically there to increase energy availability, to help us meet the expected demands. The problem with that is that it's not just dumping out some adrenaline, which will then go on to liberate energy from fat cells or liberate energy from storage at liver, etc. It's also going to open up the gut lining, induce the opening of channels inside the cells themselves, and this is transcellular permeability rather than the other type, paracellular permeability that we speak of when there's inflammation in the gut, dysbiosis, allergies, alcohol, etc. Yes, it opens up these channels in the gut, and thus you get more endotoxins, more nitric oxide, more hypoxia at the mitochondria, more of these energetic challenges, more of an imbalance between what our hypothalamus thinks it has and what it wants. And thus we can easily get into these self-perpetuating cycles of dysfunction. And suddenly it becomes very easy to see why there was that moment for most people when they were 22 or when they were whatever age it was. And from that point on, they never had the same energy, or that they never had that same bounce. And from that point on, they started to accumulate other aches and pains, other little patterns that, hey, as long as they avoid doing exercise in the evening, well, that's fine. As long as they make sure they have that fourth cup of coffee, well, that's fine. As long as they don't have carbs in lunchtime, they won't feel tired. And that's often where people are having to move further and further into a corner until there's nowhere else left to go. And that's where they'll then take action. The problem being, of course, is that single point action, which is the type that is promoted in this, one pill for every ill model, will never get on top of it. And that's where, the organic acids test can identify whether indeed we are seeing this pattern and whether there's additional issues elsewhere, whether that be in neurotransmitters, or whether that be in the balance of the microbiome, or whether that be responses to certain food chemicals like oxalates or antioxidant status. In any case, it allows us, especially when married up to the case history, to the patterns that we're seeing on a day-to-day basis. Now we can come away from that knowing, okay, we've got some very clear, obvious obstacles that we can take a look at. So one caveat I would just put out there is that as much as that's a very common thing for me to say, we should recognize that that's not likely to be a common pattern across society, because I've got a self-selecting population. People don't come and see me purely chat, tell me how good they're feeling. It's generally because they have really invested in trying to improve their health and they haven't got anywhere, and now they want to know why. So yes, very common in any individual who's not seeing the responses they should. Probably not so in the population at large. But nonetheless, when I test Olympic athletes, when I test members of the general public that might be friends of friends who don't feel bad but are curious to know, can they be optimized, you still see your fair share of shortages of mitochondrial nutrients, and that can be a downstream consequence of microbiome issues, bacteria helping to steal the nutrients we'd want, or it may well be certain metabolic pathways aren't supported due to nutrient shortages in the diet. Suddenly we're not forming the same level of carnitine or creatine, choline, etc. that we might want. Suddenly, there's impacts as a result of that. We may be over-consuming iron because there's iron filings in flour, well, conventional flour anyway. We really want to make sure that if we're not avoiding that we have enough copper to move it out of the cells. It's copper dependent enzymes that will do that. But who's eating their liver?